His glass stopped halfway to his mouth when he saw me at his table. I knew that look before Adrian ever spoke. Men in expensive rooms always wore it the same way. First amusement, then cruelty, then the lazy confidence that came from believing no one would stop them. I was standing just inside the private dining room with his revised schedule in my hand, still in the plain black suit I wore to the office, my hair pinned back, my face bare except for fatigue. The invitation had been delivered through 3 assistants and a smirk. Adrian wanted me present at dinner, not because he needed me, because his guests needed something to laugh at. The room looked carved out of power itself. Dark walnut walls, low amber light, crystal breathing gold over the long table, silverware aligned like weapons. Men with polished watches and women with sharp smiles turned toward me one by one, and I felt the exact second I became the evening's entertainment. I had spent 3 years organizing Adrian's empire down to the minute. Calls, shipments, legal shields, charitable fronts, private crises no one in that room even knew had been prevented. But to them, I was only the woman they thought looked wrong in a beautiful place. Adrian leaned back in his chair, one arm draped with terrible ease over the leather. "Evelyn," he said, as if summoning a clerk to display a file. "You made it." A few people chuckled before I answered. That told me everything. This had not been impulsive. It had been prepared. "I assumed that was the intention," I said. My voice came out level. It surprised them. It did not surprise him. One of his guests, a man with a ruby ring and a smile too wet to trust, looked me over in broad daylight cruelty. "So this is the secretary," he said. "Adrian, you should have warned us your sense of humor had become so abstract." Laughter moved around the table in small, elegant bursts, the kind designed to wound without raising a voice. Someone commented on my dress. Someone else asked whether I had been brought to take notes or absorb insults professionally. A woman near the end of the table tilted her head and studied me like damaged porcelain. I kept standing. That was the first thing they did not understand. Shame only performs when it is invited. I had learned that long before Adrian hired me. He watched me over the rim of his glass, not intervening, not rescuing, not even pretending discomfort. His silence was worse than the jokes, because it carried permission. He wanted to see whether I would crack, whether I would beg to leave, whether the plain woman who kept his world from collapsing could be reduced, in one public hour, to the ugliness others assigned her. Instead, I walked to the empty chair set halfway down the table. And I sat. The sound was barely anything. Fabric, wood, breath, but it cut through the room more sharply than a raised voice. A secretary did not seat herself among predators unless she had forgotten her place or decided she no longer needed one. I folded the revised schedule once and set it beside my plate like a claim. The woman with the sharp smile blinked. The man with the ruby ring stopped grinning for a beat. Even Adrian's fingers tightened almost invisibly around his glass. "I was invited to dinner," I said. "If this is dinner, I'd hate to see your idea of hospitality." No one laughed that time. Adrian's eyes held mine, cold and unreadable, but something in the room had shifted. He had created a joke. I had refused to become it. That did not restore my dignity. It proved they had failed to take it. And for the first time that night, his guests were no longer deciding what I was. They were waiting to see what I would do next. Adrian set his glass down with a quiet click. "Then stay," he said. I did. Crystal light slid across the white tablecloth like a blade, catching on silver, glass, and the hard edges of faces that had spent too long deciding who deserved to belong. I remained where Adrian had told me to stay, my chair slightly apart from his, close enough to be noticed, far enough to be measured. The insult that had brought me here still hung over the table like perfume gone bitter. But now it had changed shape. It was no longer a joke everyone shared. It was a mistake no one wanted to claim. A server stepped in with the next course, hands steady, eyes lowered. The room recovered in fragments. Someone lifted a fork. Someone forced out a polite question about a shipping contract. Someone else laughed half a second too late, trying to revive the old rhythm of power. I understood what they were doing because I had done a gentler version of it for years inside Adrian's office. Smooth the air, organize the damage, make men believe control had never left the room. I reached for my water before my hand could betray the tremor in it. Then I heard it. Not the words at first. The timing. A man at the far end mentioned a customs delay in Naples that should not have existed if the documents filed that afternoon had been genuine. Another replied too quickly, adding a number that did not match the schedule I had typed myself before leaving the office. It was a small inconsistency, the kind most people miss because wealth makes them careless. But numbers had always spoken more honestly to me than people did. I set my glass down and kept my expression still. Adrian noticed. I felt it before I looked up, that cold attention of his, the one that pinned weakness to the wall. When I finally met his gaze, I did not find mockery there this time. I found calculation. He had seen me listening. Worse for everyone at that table, he knew I understood more than I was supposed to. Is something amusing? One of the guests asked me, smiling without kindness. No, I said. Something is wrong. Silence did not fall all at once. It tightened. The man in question leaned back, expensive and bored. And what exactly would you know about international freight? Enough to keep my job, I thought. Enough to know when men lie with confidence because they have never had to earn it. I folded my napkin beside my plate. The Naples clearance code you just referenced was replaced 3 weeks ago. If your shipment used the old sequence, it was either delayed before departure, I looked at him fully, or it was never legal to begin with. A fork touched porcelain somewhere to my left. No one moved. The guest's face changed first, not dramatically, just a tiny failure around the mouth. It was enough. Men like Adrian lived on those tiny failures. I had seen him build empires out of pauses less revealing than that one. You're overstepping, the man said. I turned to Adrian, not for rescue, but for decision. Your revised ledger is in the black portfolio from this afternoon. Page 14. The bonded dates won't match what he's claiming. That was my choice. Not defense. Disclosure. Adrian did not answer immediately. He reached for the portfolio a server had placed earlier beside his chair, the same one I had organized before leaving the office. The soft snap of the clasp sounded louder than the music. He flipped pages once, twice, then stopped. His eyes lifted. The air in the room went thin. For the first time that night, the danger shifted away from my face and landed on someone richer, older, and far more certain of his place in the world. The cost of speaking had been real. I had not risked ridicule anymore. I had risked my position, my future, the one skill that kept me useful to men who only respected leverage. If Adrian decided I had embarrassed him, I would be finished before dessert. Instead, he closed the folder with terrifying calm. Crystal clinked softly somewhere behind me, followed by the low sweep of a waiter's shoes over polished stone. The dining room had not filled yet, but the air already carried that expensive kind of tension, the kind stitched together by old money, newer threats, and people who smiled with only half their mouths. Candlelight moved over silver, over cut glass, over the dark lacquer of a table arranged with such precision that one misplaced fork would look like an act of war. I stayed near the sideboard with the seating cards in my hand, pretending to review them for the third time, though I had memorized every name, every alliance, every grudge before we had even left the office. A pause settled beside me before a voice cut through it. You knew Romano would challenge the shipping numbers before he sat down, Adrian said. I looked at the cards instead of him. Romano never challenges numbers first. He challenges authority. The numbers are only how he dresses it. For a moment, nothing answered me except the distant hum of the refrigeration unit behind the wine wall. Then I felt Adrian's attention sharpen, cold and exact, as if he had just discovered a seam in marble and was deciding whether to split it open. He took the cards from my hand. And the others? I should have given him the safe answer. They were clients, investors, men with appetites bigger than their restraint. That was what secretaries were supposed to know. Calendars, allergies, wives' names, maybe birthdays. Not pressure points. Instead, I pointed with one finger. D'Alessio hates being seated where he can't see the door. Marino drinks too fast when he feels ignored. Vescari will flatter whoever insults him first because he thinks submission buys time. Romano and D'Alessio cannot be placed side by side unless you want a public contest by the soup course. His eyes lifted from the cards to my face, and that was worse than mockery had been. Mockery was easy. Curiosity was dangerous. You sound like you've done this before. The question came lightly. The meaning underneath it did not. I folded my hands so he would not see how tightly I wanted to grip the edge of the sideboard. I listen. No, he said. Listening explains details. not patterns. The room seemed to narrow around that one word. Outside the high windows, the city glowed in wet ribbons of amber and white, traffic moving far below like blood through veins. Inside, every candle burned steady. I became too aware of my own breathing, of the plain black fabric at my wrists, of the fact that one wrong answer could cost more than employment now. It could make Adrian believe I had entered his world under false terms. I chose my own move carefully. My mother cleaned houses in neighborhoods where hosts forgot staff could hear them, I said. People with power become careless when they think no one worth noticing is in the room. That much was true. Truth, when placed beside silence, could look complete. Adrian studied me long enough to make the lie of omission feel almost audible. And etiquette? Books, I said. A faint crease appeared between his brows. Books taught you which guest would view an apology as weakness and which one would treat it as tribute. I met his gaze then. Books taught me the rules. Men like these taught me why the rules exist. Something changed in his expression, not softness, never that, but a fracture in certainty. Until then, he had treated me like an instrument he could place at the table for sport, then remove before any real consequence attached itself. Now he was measuring whether I had arrived in his office by accident at all. He stepped closer, lowered his voice, and the distance between us became charged in a way I did not trust. Your resume says you worked 2 years in municipal records. It did not require beauty, I said. It also did not require fluency in diplomacy practiced by predators. I said nothing. Crystal chandeliers turned the dining room into something almost surgical, all white light and polished gold, every surface designed to expose weakness. By the time I stepped through the double doors, the conversation had already arranged itself into layers. Laughter from the far end, low business murmurs near the windows, the brittle clink of glasses from people who liked to perform ease. The butler announced my name without emphasis, yet the sound of it traveled farther than any dramatic entrance could have. Heads turned in sequence. Forks paused. A woman in emerald silk lowered her wineglass and forgot to lift it again. I had not come dressed as a fantasy. That would have made their work too easy. The dress I chose was black, severe, cut cleanly enough to suggest discipline rather than seduction, with long sleeves and a line that made me stand straighter than I felt. My hair was pinned back from my face, not softened to invite approval, but ordered to deny apology. The only ornament I wore was a thin silver watch, the same one I had worn in municipal records when fluorescent lights hummed overhead and men twice my rank assumed I existed to fetch what they had misplaced. A joke requires an audience willing to agree on what is laughable. The room had expected one version of me and received another, and in that small failure, I felt the first shift. Adrian Moretti was standing near the head of the table, one hand resting on the back of his chair, his expression unreadable in the way powerful men cultivate, as if stillness itself were a weapon. Yet I saw the break in timing before anyone else did. He had prepared for embarrassment, perhaps for defiance, perhaps even for a scene. He had not prepared for composure. His gaze moved once from my shoes to my face, then stayed there half a second too long. Evelyn Ward, I said to the butler quietly, as though reminding the room that my name had always been enough. Then I walked forward. That was all. No flourish. No hesitation. Just measured steps over marble so glossy it reflected the chandeliers and fractured stars beneath my feet. Men who had dismissed me in hallways now adjusted their posture before I even reached the table. One of Adrian's allies, a heavy-jawed financier with a voice built for public ridicule, smiled as if to recover the old balance. "Well," he said, "this is unexpected. Only if you never learn to look carefully," I replied. The silence after that was not large, but it was precise. It cut him cleanly. A few guests looked down at their plates. Others looked at Adrian, not at me, because rooms like this always seek instruction from the strongest animal present. What they found there seemed to unsettle them more than my answer had. He did not laugh. He did not rescue the insult. He merely pulled out the chair beside his own and waited. That simple gesture changed the temperature of the evening. I could feel discomfort travel outward like a ripple under silk and tailored wool. If I sat there as the evening's entertainment, they would know by dessert. If I sat there as something else, then every earlier cruelty would need a new name. I moved to the chair without thanking him, because gratitude offered too quickly would have restored the hierarchy they were trying to preserve. When I took my seat, I placed my napkin across my lap with steady hands and lifted my eyes to the woman across from me, the one who had smirked openly the last time she saw me carrying files. "You were discussing the Port Authority expansion," I said. "The zoning objection in District 7 will delay it another quarter unless someone has finally read the environmental easements." Her mouth parted. She had not expected me to know what the men in this room considered real conversation. Around us, crystal trembled softly against porcelain. No one spoke at once. The sound that followed was not speech at first, but the faint drag of a knife against china, too sharp in the hush, too small for the damage it marked. A few men lowered their eyes to their plates as if silverware might save them from what had just happened. Candlelight moved across the table in broken strips, catching on cuff links, crystal stems, and the polished black surface beneath our hands. I felt the weight of every stare settle, then shift. It no longer landed on me like amusement. It landed like assessment. Across from me, a man with a square jaw and a politician's smile leaned back in his chair and folded one manicured hand over the other. "Environmental easements," he repeated, tasting the words as though deciding whether to laugh again. "That's unusually specific. Only if no one has done the reading," I said. A breath of laughter escaped from somewhere down the table, but it was nervous now, not cruel. Adrian said nothing. That silence was not empty. It had edges. I could feel him watching without turning my head, measuring not whether I belonged there, but how much of the room I was about to take. The first course had barely been cleared when the real dinner began. Questions stopped sounding like questions. Remarks arrived wrapped in velvet and delivered with teeth. A woman in emerald silk asked whether long hours organizing a powerful man's life had given me an accidental education in larger matters. The man beside her wondered aloud whether loyalty made some employees overconfident. Another guest mentioned District 7 again, then casually shifted to shipping routes, insurance delays, and customs pressure near the docks, each subject placed like a coin on a gaming table. They were not testing my knowledge anymore. They were testing my reach. I dabbed my lips with the linen napkin and let the pause work for me. "Accidental education is still education," I said to the woman in silk. Then I turned slightly toward the man discussing shipping. "And insurance only becomes a problem at the docks when paperwork is made deliberately imperfect, which is useful if someone wants delay. Less useful if someone thinks delay can't be traced." His fingers stopped on the stem of his glass. A servant entered to refill wine, and in that small interruption I caught Adrian's reflection in the dark window. Still, focused. No amusement left in him now. Whatever joke this evening had begun as was dying by degrees, and everyone at the table could feel it. The square-jawed man tried again, smoother this time. "You speak as if you've been in those rooms." "I've been in enough rooms where men assume the only person listening is the one they fear," I said. "That creates very generous conditions for memory." That landed harder than I intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as it needed to. Two men near the end of the table exchanged a glance too quickly. One of them had spent the first half hour pretending not to recognize me from the office. Now he wouldn't meet my eyes. The conversation shifted once more, this time into code so old it almost insulted me. Investments that were not investments. Deliveries that were not deliveries. Alliances described as family courtesy. I answered just enough to prove I understood the map beneath the language, and each careful reply stripped something from the room. First its mockery, then its certainty, then its right to decide what I was. No one interrupted me now. When dessert arrived, untouched by most hands, the politician's smile had vanished entirely. "You're very unusual," he said. "No," I answered. "You're simply not used to women you've already dismissed being able to answer back." Even the air seemed to stop. Then, at the far end of the table, someone who had remained silent all evening finally set down his glass and looked directly at Adrian. It was not a social glance. It was a warning, quiet and cold. "So," he said, "how much does your secretary know?" Crystal trembled faintly in the candlelight as the man at the far end of the table leaned back in his chair and studied me with a kind of stillness that did not belong to polite society. The dining room, with its polished oak, low gold lamps, and expensive perfume hanging over plates no one wanted to touch anymore, seemed to contract around that single question. I had seen dangerous men bluff, posture, and perform certainty for Adrian's benefit all evening, But this was different. This was recognition. Real recognition had a way of stripping power down to bone. Adrian did not answer him immediately. I felt his attention slide toward me, sharper now, less amused than before, less certain. The joke he had built this dinner on had already cracked in public. Now something under the tablecloth of the evening had begun to move, and for the first time since we sat down, Adrian no longer looked like the only person in the room who understood the rules. The man folded his napkin with precise fingers. Silver hair, navy tie, a face lined by money, caution, and old compromise. When he spoke again, his voice was low enough to force everyone else to listen. Ward, he said, looking at me instead of Adrian. That is not a common name in the circles I survived. A pulse of silence moved around the table. I kept my spine straight and my hands loose in my lap, though I could feel every gaze sharpen. Across from me, one woman's wineglass paused halfway to her mouth. Another guest shifted so suddenly that his chair whispered against the floor. Adrian's tone came out flat. You know her? The man did not blink. I knew her father's case. A chill moved through me so cleanly, it almost felt like relief. Not because I wanted the past opened, but because secrets always weighed more in rooms like this when they belonged only to the weak. Once the powerful touched them, everyone suddenly called them history. No one at the table interrupted him. They were all measuring, recalculating, deciding whether my face, my clothes, my title, and the way Adrian had introduced me still meant what they had meant an hour ago. It was buried, the man continued. Or meant to be. A procurement scandal dressed up as embezzlement. 3 men kept their seats. One honest accountant lost everything. His eyes remained on mine. Ward refused to sign false numbers. So they signed his ruin instead. My throat tightened, but I did not look away. You remember selectively. His mouth moved, not quite into a smile. I remember enough to know his daughter should not be sitting here as entertainment. That landed harder than any insult had. The room did not simply go quiet. It turned cautious. A few of Adrian's guests stopped looking at me with contempt and started looking at me as if I were a document they should have read before dinner. Adrian's glass remained untouched beside his hand. Why would that matter now? Because, the man said, turning to him at last, if she is Evelyn Ward, then she has seen records other people paid to erase. And if she knows what her father knew, anyone who helped bury that case is suddenly having a very bad night. Something changed in Adrian's face then. Not softness. Not yet. But the last of the mockery left it completely. I could almost hear his mind moving backward through every month I had worked for him, every file I had handled, every question I had not asked aloud. He looked at me as if he were seeing not my dress, not my silence, not the insult he thought he could contain, but a locked room he had accidentally invited to his own table. I was 19, I said, because if the past was going to enter the room, it would enter standing. I learned early what powerful men do when the truth embarrasses them. No one reached for a glass after that. The silver-haired man rested both hands on the table. Crystal struck porcelain somewhere to my left, a thin, bright sound that snapped the room out of its trance just enough for cruelty to find its feet again. The silver-haired man leaned back in his chair with the bored confidence of someone who had ruined people for sport and never paid for it. His mouth curled before his words did. So that is the little tragedy behind the efficient face, he said. How moving. Adrian, you do collect unusual ornaments. A few people laughed because they were afraid not to. I did not look at them. I looked at the place setting in front of him instead. His untouched wine, his folded napkin, the black leather portfolio he had placed beside his chair when he arrived and kept within reach all night. Men who came only to dine did not guard paper like that. Then he pushed harder. Perhaps your secretary can tell fortunes too, he said, turning to me at last. Or are secrets the only trade she learned young? The insult landed where he wanted it to. On my history, on my body, on the careful fiction of the evening. But by then I had already noticed the second phone under his jacket when he stood earlier to greet another guest, and the slight ink transfer on his ring finger from documents handled recently and often. More important, I had recognized the company seal pressed into the corner of one page when his portfolio had shifted open near dessert. Not his company. A shell vendor Adrian had rejected 3 months ago. I lifted my water glass, not to drink, only to buy the room one more second. If I told fortunes, I said, I would tell you not to sign anything tonight. Silence arrived so fast it felt physical. Adrian did not move at first. His face changed in increments, like steel cooling too quickly. Explain. The silver-haired man gave a short laugh. You are really going to indulge this? Yes, I said before Adrian could answer him. My voice came out level, and that seemed to unsettle them more than anger would have. Because the acquisition file in your portfolio is not a dinner courtesy. It is a substitution packet. His eyes flicked down. Small movement. Fatal movement. I stood then, hearing the soft drag of fabric against the chair, feeling every stare fixed to me with a new and uglier hunger. Not mockery now. Calculation. If I was wrong, I would lose more than my job. I would become the evening's final joke, and Adrian would remember me as an overreaching fool who mistook pain for authority. I reached toward the portfolio and stopped just short of touching it. You keep the forged transfer pages on top because you expected him to glance, not read. The signature tabs are placed for speed. The valuation memo underneath is dated tomorrow morning, so the debt exposure appears newly discovered, which would force a rushed concession tonight. And the shell vendor in the appendix connects back to your holding group through an assistant registrar in Milan who forgot to bury the original filing. No one breathed. The silver-haired man rose so abruptly his chair legs scraped the floor. This is absurd. Then open it, I said. Adrian did. Paper whispered. A tab lifted. Another page turned. Then another. I watched his eyes track left, stop, return, sharpen. He pulled one sheet free, then a second. His jaw locked. Across from him, two guests who had arrived with the silver-haired man suddenly found the tablecloth fascinating. You planted a liability trigger, Adrian said quietly. The man spread his hands. Standard leverage. Nothing illegal. I let that lie there for half a heartbeat before cutting through it. Page 6 is illegal. The registrar code is copied from a dissolved entity. And page 9 routes control, temporarily but decisively, away from Adrian during review. Long enough for a vote. Long enough for removal. That was the true detonation. Not money. Power. Power moved through that room like a draft under a locked door. You could not see it, but everyone felt it at once. No one reached for a glass. No one shifted a chair. Even the musicians near the far wall seemed to understand, their hands suspended above strings and keys, as if sound itself had become dangerous. I stood with the folder still open in my hands, the copied registrar code exposed beneath candlelight, and for the first time that night, I did not feel like the easiest person in the room to dismiss. I felt every eye on me, measuring, recalculating, recoiling. The silver-haired man did not answer me. That, more than any denial, told the truth. I looked at Adrian Moretti then. Until that moment, he had worn his control the way other men wore tailored jackets, effortlessly, without thought, as though command had been cut to his shape. But now I watched something sharper pass through his face. Not embarrassment alone, not anger alone. Recognition. He was seeing the entire night all at once. The invitation made in mockery, the amused smiles when I arrived, the private assumption that I would sit pretty and stay useful, and then the document in my hands turning their entertainment into evidence. He had brought me there to be small. Instead, I had become the only person standing between him and a quiet coup. Across the table, someone inhaled too fast. Another guest lowered his eyes to his plate, as if porcelain could offer moral shelter. The silver-haired man tried to recover first, but his confidence had already cracked at the edges. This is a technical discrepancy, he said, and the sentence died thin in the air. No, I said. It is intention disguised as paperwork. My voice did not shake. That surprised me almost as much as it surprised them. I set the folder on the table and turned it so the pages faced outward, not toward me. It was a small movement, but it changed the geometry of the room. I was no longer defending an accusation. I was presenting a fact. Candlelight slid over signatures, dates, copied numbers, the kind of details powerful men trusted no one else to read carefully. I had spent years learning how ambition hid inside language. Tonight, that knowledge had teeth. The silver-haired man reached for the pages. Adrian Moretti placed his hand over the folder first. He did not slam his palm down. He did not raise his voice. He simply covered the paper with one steady hand, and somehow that was worse. The gesture was calm enough to be final. I watched the color drain from more than one face around the table, Because everyone there understood what I understood in the same instant. This was no longer a dinner dispute, no longer a social amusement gone crooked. This was alignment. This was Adrian Moretti deciding, in full view of allies and enemies, which side of the table I stood on now. "No one touches this," he said. The room obeyed him before the last word fully landed. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt the strange, heavy clarity that comes when humiliation changes shape but does not disappear. They were silent now, yes. Silent because I had value. Silent because I had saved something important. It was justice, but not innocence. Their respect had arrived only after usefulness. That knowledge sat cold inside me. Adrian Moretti lifted his eyes to mine, and what passed there was more unsettling than mockery had been. He was not looking at me as a joke anymore. He was not even looking at me as an employee. He was looking at me as if I had walked into a room built for predators and calmly taught them where the trap was hidden. As if he had misjudged not just my competence, but the scale of my restraint. Around us, no one spoke. No one dared to rescue the old balance with laughter. I realized then that the silence was not empty. It was a verdict, and verdicts create debts. Adrian Moretti straightened slowly, one hand still resting over the folder, the other curling against the back of his chair. The silver-haired man had gone rigid. The guests would carry this scene out with them like a stain. I had answered the question of whether I belonged in that room. I had answered it so completely that no one could pretend otherwise. But as Adrian Moretti kept looking at me, I understood the harder question had only just begun. Now that I had saved his power in front of everyone who wanted it broken, what would he do with mine? When the last guest finally found the courage to breathe again, the sound seemed too loud for the room. I did not wait for anyone to dismiss me. I set my napkin beside my plate with steady fingers, rose from my chair, and walked away from the table that had been arranged like a stage for my humiliation and had ended like a witness stand. Crystal trembled softly behind me as voices returned in careful fragments. No one laughed now. No one dared. The corridor outside the private dining room was dim, lined with dark wood and amber light, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself one slow breath. My pulse was still hard in my throat, not from fear anymore. From the cost of holding myself together while men with polished shoes and expensive watches learned that the woman they had measured by her face understood their business better than they understood their own danger. Evelyn. Adrian Moretti's voice followed me low and even, but stripped of the sharp amusement he had worn like a blade earlier that evening. I stopped. He came to stand a few feet away from me, jacket unbuttoned now, one hand loose at his side, the other still carrying the weight of command so naturally it seemed stitched into him. Under the corridor light, he looked less untouchable than he had at the table. Not weaker, just suddenly more human, which was somehow rarer. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us no longer belonged to mockery. It belonged to reckoning. Then he did something I had not expected. I was wrong. The words landed with more force than any threat I had heard all night. Men like Adrian Moretti were not built to apologize in public. Men like him were built to make the room adapt to their mistakes and call it order. But he was not in that room now. He was here, with me, and he had chosen not to hide behind power. I studied his face carefully, because a man like him could turn sincerity into strategy if it served him. But there was no performance in his eyes now. Only the cold recognition of damage done and the harder recognition that he had done it himself. "You were cruel," I said. His jaw tightened once. "Yes. You invited me there to entertain yourself. Yes. You let them believe I was beneath all of you." His gaze did not leave mine. I did. I nodded slowly, not because his honesty erased what happened, but because I wanted him to feel each word without mercy. "Then understand this clearly. What happened in that room did not save me. I saved myself. I also saved your name, your negotiations, and the illusion of control those men came to challenge. Do not confuse that with gratitude." Something changed in his expression then. Not anger. Respect, hard and unmistakable, settling into place where dismissal had lived before. "I don't," he said. The corridor was quiet enough for me to hear the muffled clink of glasses from the room behind him, the guests trying to recover from a lesson they had not expected to receive. Adrian glanced back once, then returned his attention to me as if the rest of the building had stopped mattering. "What do you want, Evelyn Ward?" It was the first time that night he had asked me anything without already assuming the answer. I met his eyes and gave him mine. A different job if you intend to keep me hidden and insulted. A different office if you intend to keep me and use my mind honestly. And if my name is spoken in your presence again, it will be spoken with respect. He did not hesitate. Done. I let that sit between us for a second, testing it for weakness. Then he added, quieter, you will never be used as a joke again. Not by me. Not by anyone near me. There it was. Not charm. Not apology dressed as seduction. A vow.